Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Steve, can you let us know if you can hear me?
I'll let you know. I hear you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your patience. We've been having some technology problems. So my name is Rebecca Shademan. I'm currently under Amber Ward's profile. We will be conducting the Community Development Block Grant 2021 Certification Training Webinar 2 today. With me on this presentation is Steve Charleston. He is the CDBG Program Manager, and we will be discussing procurement. So first up, we're going to talk about the Nebraska CDBG timeline, the different types of procurement, contract language, and also conflict of interest. Before we begin, just want to remind everyone what we talked about yesterday with national objectives. We discussed national objectives and beneficiary types and eligible recipients. We've moved, and normally most of that information is determined at time of application. We are moving through the process of our timeline to when we have received your application, we've reviewed everything, and we have awarded you funding and notified you by issuing a notice of approval letter. So kind of keep in mind where we are at with everything going on. So here is a lovely snapshot overview of the CDBG timeline after you receive a notice of approval. So we first start off with our grant agreements. So from normally everything before 2021, all of our grant agreements were for 24 months, but beginning in 2021, all grant agreements will now be 30 months. So that's something new if you're being recertified, and also if you are hired to be a certified administrator for older grants, something to be aware of with time of performance for CDBG timelines. So we're going to talk about each one of these main items within our timeline: the agreement executed, the special conditions for release of funds, the release of funds, environmental clearance, implementation of the project, and project closeout. So first up is the notice of approval. This is a letter from the Nebraska Department of Economic Development, and this really tells you that you can begin your project and everything is good. Primarily, we have a lot of information in the notice of approval that we provide to the subrecipient, and that letter should be carefully reviewed because we have several notices within it. Once the subrecipient receives the notice of approval, the local unit of government can begin incurring costs for general administrations associated with the items identified within the subrecipient agreement. So the notice of approval letter usually is sent first. Sometimes we send the CDBG agreement at the same time, sometimes a little bit later, just because we have a delay in preparing those agreement statements to everyone. But the key thing to remember is that this agreement is between the local unit of government and the Nebraska Department of Economic Development. The subrecipient has 30 days to execute the agreement and return it to the NDED. So you have 30 days from the date that you receive the agreement from the department. How we send this to everyone is through email. If we send it to the local contact that was identified on the application, and that should be also returned to us via email once it has been signed by the chief elected official of that local unit of government. So 30 days is your main objective there. We want to make sure that everything's good. We highly recommend that the agreement is reviewed because we're all human. Sometimes typos happen, or maybe something doesn't make sense to you. If you have questions, we recommend you ask those questions before executing the agreement, because you should have a full comprehension of what is all within the agreement and what you're being held to. Steve, is there anything else you want to add to agreement execution?
Not at this time. As we move to special conditions, yes. But I would emphasize what Rebecca said, because we want to make sure the agreement is correct prior to execution by the local government and any MOU that goes out, memorandum of understanding, so that the department and the local government isn't undertaking an amendment process early on in the process. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. We did receive a question about if the agreement has to be returned electronically. It can either be returned electronically or as a hard copy to the department. We will accept either one. As long as we get it back within 30 days, we're very happy. So whichever one is more favorable for your local unit of government and preference, that is acceptable to us. And it does need to be signed in blue ink, I believe. So special conditions.
Quick comment.
Oh, go ahead.
It is okay to forward, if you already have the complete agreement, the subrecipient and the review, to submit this signature page to make sure that that item is scanned and it is in blue ink, and then it'll be executed by the department and also in blue ink and scanned in back, and then you can make sure that that's saved for record keeping purposes also.
Thanks. So within the agreement, we have noted in a section, and it's called special conditions. Usually this is between 9 to 11 special condition items that the subrecipient needs to complete in order for the
So I think we lost your audio, Rebecca. So as Rebecca was saying, within the special conditions, there's a listing of those items. A number of those are standard, and then there are specials within the specials. And in cases, those would include, for example, a memorandum of understanding, especially if it is a project where the subrecipient is also working with a nonprofit or a for-profit on behalf of them. For those that have worked through the process of the CARES Act or any other programs, opportunities within, you will see that there are some other special conditions that need to be met within the time frame of those 90 days. And I don't have control of the slides. And moving on to the notice of release of funds and environmental clearance. So you have the grant agreement, subrecipient and parties execute on time. You also have the special conditions that are to be met within the grant agreement. And as you recall, the NOA, the approval letter, allows the local government, the general administrator, to actually undertake the process with regards to putting those special conditions together for the environmental clearance and also for meeting other conditions within the agreement. So when you receive the release of funds and environmental clearance letter, please read it carefully. There are items in there that it explains throughout the process, the same way with the NOA, the approval letter. You can then move forward, execute contracts for the project activities. You can begin those projects, incur those costs, and then if you have and reach that point where you have expenditures, costs, the subrecipient, the local government then can begin requesting funds from the department. Next. We'll talk about implementation of the project. Once that release of funds, there are a number of reports. At this time, some of those reports aren't available with regard to submission through Amplifund, but you would submit a semi-annual report on the project status. At a point in time, the local government would and the nonprofit would be putting together an annual audit. A notice of annual audit needs to be submitted. And then depending upon if you have program income, there's program income reporting. Through that implementation process, the department monitors the project. One of the regulatory provisions is that there be a second public hearing during the implementation on the project's progress, the status of that project as it's moved through. And that hearing should take place at a point when there is activities that can be reported to the public. And then you'll also need to complete the fair housing action as identified in the letter submitted by the subrecipient as a special condition. And you want to make sure that that fair housing action identifies, for example, if you had a training event, who trained, how many persons attended, what the benefit of that is. It's not just what you did, it's the outcome. Next. Close out. So we reached the happy point. We're actually going to close out the grant. So there's a number of final project reports that need to be submitted. There's a final financial. There's a project status report that's final. There may be a final wage compliance report if labor standards and Davis-Bacon apply. There's a final product in terms of planning projects especially. You want to make sure on your final financial, we'll talk about this more in another webinar, but you take a real solid look at the balance of funds on hand and make sure that you've asked for those dollars that you're deserving to receive, especially on the administration side and construction and housing management, because historically we found that subrecipients and the administrators have balances that they're not aware of on some of the projects. Next. So you've reached the point now where you're done. So for those persons that are on the line as attendees, you can all go home now. Please don't. I did look at the list of attendees, so we want to welcome those that are new. And there's a number of persons I recognize by name that we've worked with over the years. So welcome also. So make sure if you do have some questions, put your questions in the chat. If there's an extensive amount of detail as we move through the procurement process, it may be necessary for us to follow up with you offline outside of the actual webinar training, and we'll be glad to do that. So we want to talk about procurement overview. For those, I'm sure you've all read the manual chapter 7 procurement, the updates that are provided in there. So we put together in the manual a significant number of updates and revised the CDBG administration manual. So as recipients of CDBG funds, you're responsible for making sure that goods and services are procured competitively and compliant with the rules and regulations under 2 CFR Part 200 Subpart D. As we go through the presentation, you'll find that slides include a considerable amount of information, and the reason they're structured and laid out that way is because they provide you a solid overview of what we would be discussing as we move through. The procurement policies describe how the recipient will procure and obtain supplies, materials, service, and equipment. Significantly, procurement needs to be open and free competition as you move through the process, no matter what type of procurement is taking place. Next. Okay. Somehow we're not moving forward. Thank you. When doesn't procurement occur? So there are situations where, for example, the subrecipient, the local unit of government, is conducting those services by staff that they have in-house that have the capacity to deliver. So you could have on-staff engineer, you could have on-staff certified administrator that can conduct that. That may be the fact that you followed state statutes and you've appointed an engineer, you've appointed an attorney, the subrecipient, the local unit of government has done that. Next. And then there's also the Nebraska Interlocal Cooperation Act, which focuses on development districts. Local governments that are a member may enter into agreements directly for mutual benefit where that district serves on behalf as a part of that local unit of government. They must be, that subrecipient local unit of government must be a dues paying member, recognized as such by the district. There's also some other nuances that apply. If the application is prepared by the local government or district, that's okay. If a third party puts that together, then there is a procurement process that must be followed. So we'll go through that later on in terms of some of the exceptions and some of the actual application of when procurement takes place and does not. Next. So there's the appointment process and then the procurement process. As we mentioned, if they do in-house, the local government, the subrecipient, and they have the capacity to deliver, then procurement is not required. If you have those officials acting in official capacity on behalf of the subrecipient, it's considered in-house. And those appointments for selection of a firm to work on a project cannot be made specifically for the purpose of administering or implementing a CDBG project. So for example, if you look at a engineering firm, which can be for engineering services, following state statute, the appointment, and that appointment is made at the local organizational meeting where the body as such, the village board or the city council or the county officials actually conduct at their reorganization meeting. Appointment is placed at time of application, and there needs to be a history of that firm being appointed as the engineer for that local unit of government at that time and prior 2 years. And also that firm needs to be a firm that is actually undertaking throughout that time period projects as an engineer within that community. Next. So procurement occurs when you're going to contract for a number of services. It might be the certified administrator dealing with a owner-occupied rehab, housing management. You have a public works project where you would need a construction contractor, an engineer, architect, or you're dealing with housing and owner-occupied rehab, and there's going to be lead-based paint, or you're actually going to have a planning grant to study, and you're going to procure a planner or individual or firm to undertake that study. Next. We have a number of schematics throughout the presentation as we talk through it, procurement options, decisions and internal controls. As we mentioned, there's in-house, where that local unit of government has a capacity, and there's contracted and hired out. There's also the fact that if you do not have the capacity to deliver, contractual arrangements are what makes that an in-house, or contractual arrangements do not make that acceptable for the development district or others to do that form where they would exclude themselves from the procurement process. We want to talk about loss leaders, single firms on separate procurement process, and especially about internal control measures. Next. All right, this may take a little bit of time, but when we talk about federal regulations, maximum open free competition, which is actually in 2 CFR Part 200 Subpart D. If you haven't read through that, it's a interesting read. If you want to research how the department and other agencies follow through with compliance on the federal side. There's also tied into, as you see at the top of the middle piece, record keeping on minority women businesses. We're not going into a lot of depth here on Section 3, but there's Section 3 in terms of those businesses and individuals hired in terms of minority, low income. On Section 3 deals with low income businesses and low income individuals. Special rules for purchases. You want to make sure that you keep a record, properly document all the procedures and decisions. Compliance, we'll talk about loss leader. This is basically a statement where you, in our actual guidelines and our regulations, you'll read where if you assisted a local unit of government with an application and your assistance was provided on behalf of that individual or firm, organization, entity providing assistance, that they would select you to do services beyond that. That's not acceptable. That's out of compliance with procurement. There is also on the right side of this illustration, the application preparer is prohibited from participating in the preparation of the procurement process, especially if they dealt with the SOW, which is the statement of work within the application, if it goes beyond what would be application preparation. So that firm does not have the opportunity to participate. There are some very stringent conflict of interest provisions that we'll explain as we go through this process. So internal controls, you must establish those. And as a subrecipient, they've adopted those procurement standards and code of conduct, which they've signed off, and that local unit of government says they will adhere to those. Next. So we want to have maximum open free competition. So you've probably read through and are familiar most with the loss leader arrangement. It's not an ethical practice. It's a process where you, by working with that local unit of government and preparing, for example, an application or preliminary studies, made an offer, whether or not it's inferred or open, that will help you. We won't charge you for doing this, but remember us when it comes to procurement, or be sure that we have an upper position on the selection process. because it reduces and it, as it says, deprives, but it actually places the other parties that are looking at providing a request for the proposal submission or qualifications in a position where they don't have the opportunity to be reviewed and selected. Next. Multi-services agreements are prohibited. It's considered a conflict of interest for a firm to also be in charge of the CDBG grant administration and to oversee the engineering or architectural work for the community development block grant program. So based upon conversations that have been conducted at audit hearings with the department, it has been recommended that this be looked at in a stringent measure. So there is that conflict of interest for a firm to oversee their firm when we get to this process. So that's a note. And also it's a prohibited that there be multi-services contracts. So when you put those procurement places out there, we want to make sure that every individual entity, organization, firm, however you categorize them, has the opportunity to submit a proposal for that service. Next. Okay, procurement options. So before we move on, I'll take a breath and pause. So Amber, are there questions that arise?
Hey, Steve, can you hear me?
I can. Do I want to?
Well, we have a few questions.
Oh, good.
So are these specific things DED wants to see for appointing an engineer? It seems there is no real standard for how community.
For appointing an engineer?
Yes.
What are the standards? The standards are state statutes in terms of an engineering or attorney as far as appointment process, and it's outlined in the manual. So one, the appointment or the selection considered to be an appointment by a local unit of government prior to application submission, and that is the first time that firm has been what they considered appointed as their engineer, is not sufficient. For the program, the appointment needs to be one, at an official organizational meeting, say their reorganization meeting by the city council, village board. That firm as an appointed municipal engineer also needs to have a history of service and reappointments. And then they need to be also charging for their services according to the fees that are reasonable to bill out. They should be also undertaking the infrastructure improvements as an engineer for that municipality, a local unit of government, unless it's a situation where that firm has not the capacity to do so. And there are situations where on certain infrastructure, maybe on sanitary solid waste disposal. What's the other questions? Since there's silence, I assume there's no other questions.
Can you hear me, Steve?
No, I can.
Okay. So the other question is, if a community has appointed someone from a firm and their street superintendent, as their street superintendent, is that the same as the community appointing the engineering firm for all of their projects?
No, not acceptable.
Okay, that's all the questions.
That's a very specific appointment for the 1 and 6 year street plan as superintendent. They're appointing that individual, and the appointment for the engineering, that doesn't work. Okay, we'll move on. So we've laid out here, thank you for the questions too, I appreciate it. That helps clarify some of the items as we move through. You have a schematic here of the procurement options from in-house to contractor hired out. The internal controls, we'll talk about micro, small, competitive, sealed bids, competitive proposals, and non-competitive. And then when you split out competitive proposals, there's the RFQ. That's for the architects and the engineering firms. And then there's a request for proposals, and we'll talk about conflict of interest. So this is a brief overview of the balance of the presentation. Next. And you'll also notice in the schematic the reference to CFR 200 Part D. So there are some updates that have taken place with regards to CFR 200 Part D, which deals with the procurement process. And you can find the specifics of that in 200.317, moving through that with 200.320 on methods of procurement to follow. And so if you go into that electronic version, you will find all of that information. So micro purchases not used often under CDBG. Those are for obtaining small quantity of supplies and services. There's a $10,000 threshold. And then, of course, when you get to acquisition, construction under Davis-Bacon, DBRA means Davis-Bacon and related acts. There's still that $2,000 threshold, and you can't split that up to make that less than on projects. And there's also a services threshold when it comes to service agreements at $2,500. That's for micro purchases. And we'll move next to small purchases. So there's a micro and there's a small. Obtaining small quantities of supplies, there is a $250,000 or less in the aggregate. And as we go through this, please remember that if your local unit of government has placed procurement rules, if you're working with a local unit of government that are more stringent, follow those. If the state has rules that are more stringent that need to be followed, you'd follow those. These are at the federal level. You document the receipt of adequate number, at least 3, price or rate quotations from qualified vendors. So for small purchases, you would seek those vendors that provide that type of service and would have price quotes from those. And then going to next. So there's a number of items you need to do. You need to write down what you need to procure. You need to make those solicitations. If you have verbal quotes, you need to make sure that documented the grantee in writing are acceptable at less than 500. So make sure you record what those are. You want to work with the lowest responsible bidder. And then you want to follow up and make sure they know the action that was taken and who that bidder is. And then there'll be a contract with that lowest responsible bidder, an agreement that you'll enter into as a contract. Competitive sealed bids. Next. So we deal with competitive sealed bids, and here we're talking about construction projects where you're dealing with a large quantity of goods, materials. That may be, for example, street paving, storm sewer, water lines. So you would have competitive sealed bids. They'd be based identifying the firm. There's a fixed price quote, lump sum or unit price, depends upon the type of details that are put together in that bid document. And you select that vendor or contractor basically on price, but they still need to be a responsive bidder and they must be responsible. So you would also do some other reviews of that firm that submits that bid. Next. So under the competitive sealed bids, you need to make sure that there's advertisement, publications. One way is of general circulation. There's a number of mechanisms and means to publicize. There's certain formats, organizations. There's newspapers for one. We look at publicizing the bids. We'll talk about some of the issues with procurement on when it comes to publicizing later. Solicit bids from an adequate number of suppliers. You give them an adequate number of time to respond based upon the bid opening. And there's some other nuances in terms of labor standards that fall into this. Must include complete and accurate specs and attachments, define the services and needs. And of course, they must be open publicly at the time and place stated in the invitation for bids. So you would have a bid document, for example, on a construction project that would lay out all the rules that apply to the program and apply to that contractor submitting a bid, and all of the specifications for that project that you're having them bid on. It would be known when that bid opening would take place, and there is a deadline for submission of those bids. And next. We look for under the procurement when it comes to competitive sealed bids, hopefully there's at least 2 or more responsible bids for each transaction. If that doesn't happen, you need to contact the department, contact your program representative in that case to make sure what the process is that the subrecipient needs to go through that local unit of government. Say, for example, if they received only 1 bid or no bids, in some cases they're rebid. In some cases, we may take that and look at whether or not we can move into sole source or not. Firm fixed price of award, lowest responsible and responsive bidder. So this is where you must make sure that they responded in whole to the bid document and that that bidder has the capacity, the history to undertake that project. So the local unit of government can decide not to accept bids. It's not uncommon to rebid projects, especially if they exceed those bids. And we'll talk at one time, as some are familiar with, alternates or alternatives within bid documents. So you can reject them all. That's up to that local unit of government and the entity or that, say, firm, maybe the engineer that's reviewing those bid documents also to make sure that, or the architect, that they're compliant with the specs within the bid document. Next. Competitive proposals for obtaining professional services. So when you're seeking to hire and asking for assistance, where you need an engineer, an architect, an administrator, someone to deal with housing management, lead-based paint, or a planner, this is where you get into competitive proposals. You'll want to make sure that more than one source submits an offer. It's a fixed price, not to exceed type of contract that's executed. This is generally used when we're not using sealed bids. So in most cases, this is used for those professional services that you would put out. Next. There's a distinction as we move through this on RFPs and RFQs. So there's a request for proposals and for qualifications. They must be publicized and identify all evaluation factors and how they're the level of importance they weigh. So when you put out a proposal, you need to publicize it, and publicizing it doesn't exclusively mean in a newspaper of that community. It needs to be publicized so that it's available. So if there's other means to publicize it, please do. We've had a number of situations where the subrecipient, that local unit of government, and those that are doing the procurement process post in a newspaper of circulation of 200. That's not really a publicizing the fact that there is available. You need to solicit those proposals from an adequate number of qualified sources. When it says at least 3, that doesn't mean that's the cap. You need to make sure that you do provide, if at all possible, opportunity for those firms and individuals that have the qualifications and capacity to actually undertake and respond to that proposal, whether it's an RFP or an RFQ. The department, when looking at and reviewing those firms in terms of the procurement process, we do have issues when that individual or firm does not offer those services. So cautionary, make sure that you do 3 at least. I would recommend, based upon, depending upon the location where you're at, that you do solicit to have an adequate number of responses in order to evaluate services, that you expand that beyond 3. You need to have and make sure that there's a means to evaluate the proposals and that the criteria in the RFP is set out for selecting those awards. Next.
Hey, Steve, Rebecca here. Hopefully you can hear me.
Is this Rebecca or Amber?
It's Rebecca. There's a lot of creativity going on.
Hey, here I am. Hi.
Yeah. So I just want to let everyone know when we go out monitoring, we do review the score sheet. And one of the things that we've seen on is we have score sheets where they're not completely filled out. And so it's not clear to us on how the local unit of government completed each component of the proposal. So please keep that in mind. You do need to keep records. You need to evaluate each proposal that comes in, so we understand how you came to the conclusion of selecting that entity.
Is that it?
That's it.
Oh, okay. Well, I put myself on camera so that everybody would know that it is a person speaking to you. So as we move on, awards must be made to the responsible firm whose proposal is to your benefit, considering price and other specific factors considered. And this is on requests for proposals. You must use competitive procedures in terms of qualifications, base procurement for architects and engineers, professional services. Qualifications are evaluated and the most qualified competitor is selected in terms of negotiation of fair and reasonable compensation. So when we talk about, move over here, we want to make sure that on the RFQ, the request for qualifications, that you actually do have a selection process also, criteria laid out. The selection is not price. It's not based upon a cost, but you do have the opportunity when you make that selection under RFQ, when you determine this firm is a firm to work with based upon their proposals, to negotiate, especially once you get to the part of how much is it going to cost for you to perform those services for us. And if you feel that's unreasonable, you can move on to another firm that's on that selection process or enter into negotiations. Next. So under the 2 CFR 200, there's a number of items that can be used in terms of competitive proposals to evaluate the expertise of the firm, their experience in terms of what you're asking them to do for those services, the complexity of the project, the past record of performance, identifying other clients in terms of the work timeliness, cost, and if you need to and feel it's wanting to contact those references. Capacity of the firm to perform the work, time limitations, current and planned, and the familiarity of the firm with the type of problems applicable to that type of project that you're asking them to submit a proposal on. Next. So there's two subparts or two main components on competitive proposals. That's your RFP, request for proposals, and that's your RFQ, which deals with qualifications. The RFQ ties into engineers, architects, where they submit their qualifications, and that excludes a price quote at that time. Next. So an outline of the RFP, clearly and accurately states the technical requirements, outlines the scope of service, cost, pricing, and remember that when we're dealing with contracting, entering into agreements, there is not a cost plus a percentage. So even on any of the competitive sides, there's no cost plus a percentage. It has to be a fixed amount or a lump sum not to exceed. You must publicize the RFP and request by parties that have an opportunity to complete. Hopefully you would submit those to those parties so that you would have an adequate number of responses come in. Next. So make sure that you're submitting those proposals for responses to those that have the qualifications. There'll be an evaluation of those proposals by a representative group team within that subrecipient local unit of government or within those, depending upon the type of activity, to actually go through that process of evaluation and selection. You can conduct negotiation if need to, and you would make that award to that firm entity that's most responsive and responsible contract with. Okay. This method is used for procuring architects or engineering services. They're based upon the qualifications. As we mentioned, price is not a selection factor. You review and you rank, select the most qualified firm to undertake that proposal. As we go through this presentation and other webinars, as we said yesterday, remember that parts of what we're delivering you need to either have available or retained when it comes to the evaluation conducted at the conclusion of the webinars falling in a time period so designated in order to be certified or recertified under the program. Next. You need to document it. That's a clear-cut item in terms of moving that forward. So make sure that you do document that determination. Okay, Amber, any questions so far again?
Hey, Steve, we do have one question.
Oh, good.
Does it count that you may have a letter from a contractor stating they declined to bid?
That is preferred than no letter. Yes, it's helpful if you send out to those organizations, individuals, the proposal, and then if it's a silent response, you're not sure, one, if they received it, and two, whether or not they just decided not to say respond. Yes, it's extremely beneficial to have a response from that contractor, firm, vendor that they declined to participate, especially if they give a reason, but sometimes they don't, they just decline. But When you send out your proposals, you may ask in a friendly fashion if they're not responding with a proposal, if they could at least respond that they received your proposal. You may want to send that out in a fashion that they have to sign for receipt of the proposal. So if addresses have changed and if contact persons have changed, or if that firm is no longer in the business, so to speak, of delivering that type of services, it's helpful to know. So the answer is yes.
All right, thank you, Steve. That was the only new question.
Okay, that was a long answer for yes. If you have any other questions, please ask. This slide just gives you an overview of what we've talked about. Requests for qualifications, architect, engineers, most qualified, not a price. The request, you need to have those technical requirements put together, state them. You need to publicize that request for proposal. You need an adequate number of qualified sources, solicitation-wise, but hopefully responses. And you must conduct a technical evaluation and award to the most responsible and reasonable offer. And as mentioned, you need to have a record of how that took place based upon the evaluation and those persons that did the evaluation. Okay, next.
Hey, Steve, we had another question come in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay, is the decline letter sufficient in terms of not having to seek approval for a sole source procurement, i.e. if a village receives one bid and one letter stating they are declining to participate, is the sole source approval still needed?
That's an excellent question. So we'll move on to the next slide and slides. And on sole source procurement, if you read the 2 CFR 200 and the procurement sections, you'll find that this method is very limited and must receive approval prior to. So if for a reason you only have one response that's responsible, if you only have one response to your proposal, whether that's for services or otherwise, you do need to contact the department and to have approval as a sole source. And this is critical. The federal funding agency, HUD, during the monitoring visit conducted this year, brought this situation specifically to our attention with one of our subrecipients at the time called a grantee, local government in terms of sole source. So we do not want this overlooked by the subrecipient local government or any other entity that's receiving the federal funds on behalf of that local unit of government. So before you make that approval, contact us so that we can authorize that the process used is okay. You need the department's approval. So there are specific instances where this can be used, where you've decided that the other methods were not feasible. The item that you're purchasing or service only available from a single source. So that may be a brand name or a product that only is produced by one source, and you would need to document that. There may be during the process of conducting the project that there is an emergency that takes place and you did not have the timing to go out for competitive procurement because if it wasn't undertaken, then, for example, the water would be shut off in that community for a long period of time while you're improving and installing the wells, for example. Or you determine that the competition was inadequate after a solicitation of proposals from a number of sources. And this is where we get into the process. If you move to the next slide. That is why you need to come to the department where you determine that the competition is inadequate because you have one response. So you need to move forward. An example of that, we had a project where there was activities of fire truck and apparatus, and based upon the proposal and the needs of that subrecipient, that local unit of government, specifications necessary, they had one response. And they needed to take that to the department for that approval and to follow through with that. So that's an example of how that can happen. And you may have a case where there's only one organization that wants to make a bid on a project, professional services or otherwise. Okay, procurement methods. This gives you an outline of what we've been discussing in terms of cost plus a percentage of construction costs is exclusively prohibited. So we want to make sure that's understood, and I would keep note of that. That may come up later after the webinars are over. There's informal, formal, and non-competitive processes under sole source, which we've explained where those are those opportunities that arise for sole source. There's informal micro purchases and small purchases. Usually those don't take place. It is possible within the program to happen, and upon the project activity that's undertaken. There's the formal processes, competitive sealed bids. That's usually construction projects, large quantities of goods and services, fixed price, firm pricing, award to the lowest, most responsible bidder. And then you have competitive proposals, which deal with professional services, whether it's RFQ for architects and engineers or requests for proposals from other professional services. Okay, moving on. We have unacceptable procurement practices. It must be that it's open and free competition. Any individuals, firms, organizations that provide assistance in terms of drafting specifications, requirements, a statement of work, invitation for bids, or request for proposals. So participation in the procurement process, for one, excludes you from bidding on that. So providing assistance to that local unit of government, that subrecipient or other entities, prohibits you from bidding on that proposal. Next.
Hey, Steve, we had a question come through.
Oh, good. I need a break.
Okay. If you receive only one bid through the competitive sealed bid process, do you need to request permission through non-competitive or sole source process with the state?
What you need to do is you need to come to the state. You need to identify the event, in other words, how that took place, and you need to make sure that that process is approved by the department. So in most cases, if it's compliant and acceptable, responsible by the local unit of government and reviewed by the firm, engineer, architect, according to the bid documents on a construction project, they need to contact us. And in most cases, we would see no reason if that's acceptable by that entity, that local unit of government, to undertake that project. But it's the best to contact the state in case we determine that is a sole source. So we'll talk about the bid process. generally, as you read through procurement requirements in 2 CFR 200 subpart D, they talk about 3 bids are acceptable. After a solicitation of a number of sources, it may be appropriate to convert this process to a non-competitive proposal, which means that you would actually move into the fact that you would be asking to go into sole source, and you must consult and obtain the department approval. So this answers the prior question also. So hopefully that you would look at that and you would make sure to contact your program representative, and then if based upon the condition we need to move that to sole source, we would do that, considering there's an adequate number of responses. So if you only have one bidder on the project, you need to contact us too. In that case, next. Rebecca talked yesterday about SAM.gov and the requirement for federal funds that are passed down. Every organization, business, or contractor, we check in SAM.gov, or actually the administrator should be checking to make sure that they're not debarred. There are those entities who receive funding that need to be active and registered. Our department is. The local unit of government, the nonprofit, and the business that's receiving assistance. There is also a registration process with the state of Nebraska too. So if you're unsure of what that is, contact us and we can help you on that. And if you need assistance with SAM, the Nebraska Business Development Center, as mentioned, is a source to go to. Next. Federal requirements, you need to maintain records. If you have a pre-qualified list, it's okay, but you need to make sure that you have that list and that they are eligible and how you put them on there. Competitive advantage, debarred, ineligible, written procedures, contract pricing, we'll talk about these, protest procedures, documentation, and code of conduct. Minority business participation and women businesses. You need to make sure that going through that process is best possible, that you're identifying those minority and women-based businesses so that they can participate in the receipt, and that's part of the record-keeping process on our semi-annual report. Section 3, we're working on a policy statement since there's a number of items that have come out recently on the tracking of Section 3. Section 3 at the 30,000 foot level, or however you want to look at it, overview, it's based on low moderate income persons, and it's also based on businesses that do employ those persons that they consider to be a business that, and it may be owned by a person that's low moderate income. So Section 3, keep a lookout for the updates that are coming out with regards to our policy that'll be issued and some of the updates on how to document and how to track and how to record. Next. Did you want to add anything on Section 3, Rebecca?
Yes, Steve. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yes.
We'll be issuing a policy memo, and then our plan is to also host a training presentation on the new regulation of Section 3. So please keep an eye out, and we'll be sending notification of that in the next week-ish time period. So we won't be talking about Section 3 in detail during this training, but please plan on participating at that specific training. Thank you.
So is this a good time to take a brief break? Or do you want to keep going? Well, since there's no response, we'll keep going. Is it okay to procure before award? In other words, Is it okay during the process and anticipation of being a awardee, subrecipient, or being successful? But you still need to apply, you still need to follow procurement process. So the entire process for the purchase of goods and services for the procurement needs to be followed. It needs to be done fairly. You need to make sure that you're dealing with those most responsible and responsive organizations, individuals for those goods and services. And you must be sure you are compliant with conflict of interest. As we stated earlier on with the NOA, the notice of approval, if you do not have a notice of approval, and depending upon the type of service that you're procuring, if you contract for those services, you're paying for that on your own, unless it's not something directly tied to what you would be approved as a local government award as a subrecipient in the program. Next.
Hey, Steve, this is Amber. We can take a break. This is probably a good time, if it's okay.
Okay, thank you. I need to rest my legs now while I'm
Okay,
standing doing the presentation. But yeah, we'll take a break, and then if those on the line have questions, it's a good time to submit them if you'd like to put them into the chat. And then if you find that you come across with questions when we're done, please send those to Rebecca or me, as far as making sure, or Amber, to make sure that there's a communication back to you. So we do appreciate your attendance. We'll take a break and come back.
We'll probably be back at 10:30. We'll start up at 10:30.
10:30. Thanks,
Yep.
Amber.
Hey, Steve, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, so we have 2 questions.
Okay.
If a board member is a contractor in said community and has done their best to remove himself from all project discussions, is it a conflict of interest to bid on the project?
First, it depends upon what he did in consideration of doing his best or her best. For one, the individual would disclose to the board the conflict, whether it's real or perceived. And in this case, there's a real connection. Then that individual would need to not participate in any of the process procedures, whether it's selection of voting, putting together any of the procurement for that assistance. And then if it was thought necessary, there's also the Accountability and Disclosure Commission. We find that we, meaning the department, state in a number of cases, communities have limited avenues for those sources that can provide the services, especially in the construction service realm, and that to prohibit them from participation. But what I would encourage you to do in this case is to contact your program representative. So if we needed to issue a waiver, which we've done in the past, for example, when the chief elected official was involved in the process and they stepped aside, So there's times when we would need to do that. The second part of that is, and what I always recommend, is that the local unit of government have a discussion with their attorney to make sure that the process and procedures taken is compliant with the local unit of government's requirements, regulations, procurement code of conduct, and also with state process. So the answer is yes, depending upon what that individual has done to say step aside and disclose that conflict. If it's obvious that for that individual or their firm to participate, that it is to them or the attorney, there may be a different opinion, but the department, we're not giving an opinion. That's why you need to go to the, what we always ask is that you contact the municipal or county attorney in that case, and upon that relationship. Any other questions?
Yes, we do have one more. Is it acceptable to procure for services, for example, professional services prior to grant application being submitted, but include language in the motion to approve that states this approval is dependent upon the receipt of release of funds?
Well, if you procure prior to the availability or the access to enter into an agreement, whether it's an execution date, because for whichever purpose is not awarded yet, approved, or there's not money to pay for it, I would say that would be up to the local unit of government and whether or not that was acceptable by those in terms of who you would select, and also that when you put out your proposal through the procurement process, you would want to identify the conditions that are tied to that approval or that acceptance. So you can accept the proposal as far as going through the procurement process appropriately, compliant, and then make a determination and a recommendation of that firm. And in a number of cases, especially on projects that deal with constructions, bids are only good for so long. You may find you're in a situation where that firm may not hold their bid except for a period of time. So if you want to go that route, that's a choice that local unit of government makes, but you need to make sure that those parties bidding through that procurement process have an understanding that if not successful, you're not moving forward. Any other questions?
That was the last one.
Okay. So the next slide says, is it okay to procure before award? Yes, it is. But do not enter into a contract. As we talked about in response to that question, you still need to follow the procurement rules and document that process. And you need to make sure there's no conflict of interest involved, that it's compliant with the conflict of interest provisions. And when we wrap up the presentation part, we'll next go into the handouts. We'll give you some very specific, if you haven't read the handouts yet, I encourage you to do so, in terms of integrity bulletins that have been provided by federal agencies. So next. So in bold font, caps underlined. As we mentioned, you may be looking to procure for general administrative services. You're not going to want to contract prior to, except for general administrative services, prior to release of funds for any services. So when you have that approval process, you can begin that for general administration, but you want to wait for everything else until you get to that release of funds. We don't want to jeopardize the process. And if you're putting together an agreement, you want to execute that agreement prior to those dates. I mean, following those dates in terms of the NOA and the release of funds. Please don't put together an agreement that you signed before, but it says it's only effective on this date, because you're actually issuing an agreement on the date of execution based upon those signatures also. And we look at that as being issued prior to either the notice of approval in the case of general administration, or prior to the release of funds for all other factors. Okay, questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, we do have a question, Steve. If
Okay.
if the USDA is paying for engineering services on a water or wastewater project, may a jurisdiction enter into a contract for these services prior to release of funds?
Well, there's a number of cases where they've already done that, for one. The services provided then, in this example, by USDA and paid for by USDA, and not a part of any match or other sources that are necessary to take on the CDBG grant, they can do that. We just consider that to be operational outside of the actual grant agreement in terms of what we have with the subrecipient, and also it's not part of the budgeting process for the CDBG budget, because we understand that it does happen at times where there is another funding agency, and in order to do what they need to do, they hire that engineering firm ahead of time. So they may be already working on that project. Any other questions?
Yeah,
So
we do. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, no, I'm saying we still do honor that practice or that approach that we worked with USDA for many years. Go ahead.
So the other questions, so general admin agreement can be entered after notice of award and before release of funds?
Well, in order to meet the special conditions that are provided, for example, you have the notice of approval. If timing works well, we issue the agreement at the same time as the approval. We expect the agreement to be signed within 30 days if all's set in place. Within the agreement are several special conditions. So in order to complete those special conditions, you would enter into an agreement with an individual or a firm so that those costs that they're incurring can be, in other words, paid for. So to complete the special conditions, that's a necessary item in terms of what takes place with regards to the reaching the level of release of funds and environmental clearance. So the environmental review record is a component of the special conditions too. Rebecca, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. So we can't hear Rebecca good. Yeah, so it's the operational procedure that needs to take place in terms of, and what they would, agree to perform in their scope of services would also include, record keeping. They would maintain those records, and they would set up the structure with regards to looking at the financial management certification. And when that local unit of government signs off on that subrecipient, that individual or organization, entity that's doing the administration, working with the local unit of government, would make sure that they're compliant with all those items on the financial management certification for record keeping and tracking of the funds, whether they're the federal CDBG or the matching funds that go into the grant. Any other questions?
Yes, so housing management agreement cannot be entered into until after release of funds. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that was the last question.
Right, okay, but you would look at if you needed to do, for example, as one of the special conditions under the agreement, it states, unless it's prior to, depending upon the opportunity, you would be packaging and making sure that the guidelines are available and the standards for housing and commercial rehab if it's a downtown project. But the actual housing management and construction management are take place after the release of funds, as with other professional services agreements. Any other questions pop up?
Nope, that's all we got for now.
All right, I'll get out of my chair and stand up. Thanks. So moving along, as we've talked and emphasized, document your process for procurement for professional services. So there needs to be a file maintained for each professional services that is entered into by that subrecipient, or if it happens to be through the nonprofit or the for-profit business. So whether you have an RFP or an RFQ, the documentation of advertisement, firms contacted, proposals received, the written evaluation, score sheets, basis for selection, because it may be asked of you to provide those to us so that we can validate, especially when we're getting into sole source. So it's a key component. I would encourage you, as you also develop the files for the procurement process, that you're also developing your financial records to track those individual agreements so that you can track them according to that fixed price or not to exceed amount as you are successful in paying for those costs through Amplifund and CDBG dollars and match dollars. Next. There are a number of contract provisions for professional services contracts. We have samples in the case of engineering architecture, maybe the standard that's put out by their associations, as long as they include what we need to have included. And also if on those agreements that the federal and the standard clauses are attached to that agreement. So there needs to be a contract terms, effective date, time of performance when it's completed. You need to identify, of course, who that firm is, individual that's you're providing that agreement with. Method of compensation. It's not going to be an open contract. There are opportunities, as you'll provide within the agreement, on addendums to the contract, which may take place if funds need to be added. You have to remember that the CDBG, in terms of the actual funds provided, additional funds are not provided with CDBG to pay those costs. So be cautionary on that. There needs to be a detailed scope of work and that scope of work will tie into the billing as far as invoices go and your requests for reimbursement or advance through the Amplifund process for source documentation. The federal standard provisions, those can be an attachment to the agreement. You must make sure there's termination, convenience, transfer of interest, assignment, maintenance, access of records, those standard components that are within that agreement. Next. Did we already do that one? Okay, thanks. I was paying attention, Amber. So that's good. Sometimes there are items that are missing, and in common, we find that the proof of advertising, if it was actually put in a newspaper, publicized, how other ways did you publicize it? I would encourage you not to rely upon the posting of it in 3 places or whatever places in your community as a means to publicize, because that does not publicize the proposal. That does not provide the opportunity for others to be aware of it. You need to actually send those out to those firms that have the qualifications within a reasonable distance of your community. We want to see copies of all the proposals that are received. We're looking at the valuation, the scores of those and those that are on the committee, how the selection was developed and how it was completed. So we take a look at what you publicize as your selection criterion, looked at all the criteria and compared that to the evaluation and determination. And then we'll also look at how you weighted those selection criteria. You want to make sure that the government has available the local government's minutes and that they actually took official action to authorize entering into those agreements, and then executed copies of all the contracts. And in some cases, especially on the distribution of funds, source documentation, we're looking at those professional services contract being uploaded into Amplifund. Questions? Go ahead. Next. There's other types of items that sometimes are missing. The criteria for judging isn't clear, and that the criteria that's put in there is not, for example, an unfair advantage. So one of your criteria, if you say this firm has to have experience with the community for the past 10 years for doing these services, or any firm, that's pretty weighted towards being not acceptable in terms of an unfair competition. You need to, with your best efforts, look at obtaining services from minority-owned and female-owned businesses, if those can be identified. You do not want to execute contracts prior to the release of funds for other than admin services. And you want to make sure that all the state and federal requirements are contained in the contracts or attached to the contracts that are entered into. Next. And there's a number of other items. Lack of reason for selection, the scope of services is very vague, doesn't tie in, doesn't give a listing of what needs to be performed. The time of performance isn't date timed. If it's agreement that includes regulations that are out of date, that does happen. We do encourage the applicants and the subrecipients to make sure that documents that are submitted, for example, one, the procurement and code of conduct, procurement procedures and code of conduct, that is the current one, and that all other firms are current. In other words, if you've been involved in the program prior, a local unit of government or administrator or other party, and maybe it was 10 years ago, a number of those forms have been updated. So if they signed them 10 years ago, I would recommend highly that they look at what's new and sign those now or at the time that they're presenting them with part of their application or as part of their documentation on special conditions. One of the items that's common is that during our review, we have come across a number of organizations, firms, individuals, they don't even provide those services. And it may be as such with the COVID and the pandemic and the lack of businesses being operational, that you want to make sure that that firm is still in business and that they're still providing those services. So ahead of putting out and sending a proposal to a firm, make sure that they're active in undertaking that proposal as what is listed within it. Same thing that goes for certified administrators. Make sure they're certified, or that entity has certified administrators on their list for that firm or that district or whoever that may be. Next. So there's a number of monitoring issues that can fall into place under procurement. We've talked about those items that are, say, commonly missing or we've come across. We want to make sure that for admin services that there's documentation of those at special conditions. So in terms of what's provided, minutes, we look for those minutes showing the appointment approval for those 2 years and the year current. So those professional services agreements are in place. So those are a couple of items that usually tie into conflict of interest. This is an interesting closure for the presentation. And then we'll go into the appendix and any questions. So when you're doing procurement, be aware of any potential conflict of interest, whether that's real or perceived, because no employee, officer, or agent may participate in the selection, award, or administration of a contract supported by federal award if he or she has a real or apparent conflict of interest. And that arises when there's a financial interest or a tangible personal benefit from an entity considered for a contract. So when we look at conflict of interest, we've expanded that conflict of interest into CDBG General Administration. We've taken that as we've been coached by HUD and by looking at how others are undertaking this. If there is a conflict, when the grant administrator also oversees the engineering or architectural work for the project. So cautionary on the procurement side for general administration with that engineer, architects, also the principal of the firm that is undertaking the project. So same overseeing, same is a conflict of interest in terms of how the state views that under the CDBG program and under 2 CFR 200 Part D. So unless there's other questions, we'll move into the appendix. And just a minute, I'm sorry. I forgot to say what Rebecca wanted me to say. Rebecca asked that I remind you that in the General Administration Manual for CDBG, procurement is in Chapter 7. That's it. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve.
No, you're welcome.
Okay, so we do have one question. Does DED have suggestions on how to obtain MeWe services? And would DED ever consider a web page with bidding opportunities that might serve as an alternative to the small town newspaper?
The first part of that, many years ago, the department attempted to put together a minority business enterprise listing. And we worked with an organization out of the city of Omaha. The dilemma is there's such a high turnover in terms of those minority businesses, women businesses, and we couldn't keep track ourselves. You may want to contact associations, whether it's those that deal with architects, engineers, or other, the Nebraska League of Municipalities, the County Officials Association, if they have an awareness of those firms that are in the capacity. And when it comes to minority women, as far as ownership, it has to be greater than 50%. So if you have a partnership with male, female, the ownership, the female has to have at least 51%. Be counted. So I don't have a clear answer to that. Rebecca, do you?
So in addition to advertising in small town newspaper, especially with this pandemic, a lot of people have been also advertising bid opportunities on websites. So that is another option too, if not everyone gets the local newspaper. Overall, just trying to make bidding opportunities available to as many people as possible, doing your best efforts and documenting those efforts that you have done so would be great. It's very difficult in rural portions of the US to understand that, but we do need to document the efforts being made. That's it for me, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So there may be, and you may have the opportunity with Nebraska associations to make contacts. I know I believe in the, I don't know the name of the resource or term, but I know a number of engineers, architects work with other media organizations to post projects that are available for those in the construction trade to bid on, which if you publicize through that, use that avenue and you document that, that's one means of publicizing, and it's probably a broader reach, but you also need to make sure that you're reaching out in case there's those firms that access publications. So there's those avenues, but on the minority and women base, that's a real difficult one, especially within the spatial distribution within the state and the difficulty of knowing. There may be some firms that provide those services that are women-based, minority-based in the communities. Dependent upon the community, there may be more opportunities within that to contact those organizations that could give you that, provide you that information. What was the second part of that, Amber? The second question?
So they were wondering if NDED would consider a web page with bidding opportunities that might serve as an alternative to the small town newspaper.
I would say no, but I'm only saying it from the standpoint of how you would have to manage it, and we'd have to manage. If we're managing that web page, that's a time consumer for one, and the responsibility is on the subrecipient on the procurement side. They, for one, may want to put it on their web page, and they may want to send it out to other communities to post. There are organizations that do that, so I would find those avenues. And as I said, maybe the Nebraska League of Municipalities knows of those organizations. Contact them, or the County Officials Association, or there are public administrators association. And within those municipal and county, they do have other contacts that may be available to do that. And I know they do provide an oversight on a number of firms that are listed in there. Of course, some of that's an advertisement as such, but you can identify those firms. So if your first time into the program, for example, as a subrecipient, and you're undertaking this and you're not sure who to get a hold of, I would encourage you to communicate with others that have participated in the program in terms of how they've gone through that process over time too. Any other questions?
Well, we did have a comment. Barb Pierce was kind enough to share with us that the REACH program through the Omaha Chamber is a relevant one for reaching minority businesses in construction.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And then I'm not sure that program, how far out into the state it goes, but still it is a good one to know.
And then that was everything, Steve.
Okay, all right. That concludes the presentation as far as a slideshow. We do have, and want to make sure that you're aware of the handouts. And Rebecca, do you want me to read all these handouts to them?
Sorry, Steve. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do you want me to open them and read them all?
Let me bring them up real quick because we're at the end of our presentation. Is that correct? Or
Yes.
you? Give me 1 second.
I mean, if I can hear you, they can probably hear you.
We have no way of knowing.
Oh.
So
Well,
we do have several of these documents we uploaded and made available to everyone. I'll bring them up. I'm starting with 01.
the integrity bulletin.
Yep. I'll bring that over and share with the group.
So do we need someone out there to let us know if they can hear you besides me?
No, I think you're a good person.
I didn't mean that. Okay, I see it.
Okay, perfect. So these are integrity bulletins that the Office of Inspector General has issued in regarding procurement and contracting. These are kind of helpful guides that are a nice condensed version. As you can see, I believe these were made available to us a couple years ago. So some of the references within the CFR might not align because there was a refresh within the 2 CFR Part 200 within the last year. So just be aware of that, but overall the content and references are very important and valuable of use. Is there anything you want to highlight, Steve?
Well, within that bulletin, just scrolling through it on my other monitor, and I opened it. It's a good read because if you look at maintain separation of duties, that's very important, and that's part of an audit process too. So separation of duties, and then you get into record keeping and ethics and conflict of interest. So they're not lengthy, and they're, I believe, beneficial to read through those. And the one on conflict of interest is also, go ahead.
That is 02 and was also provided in your handouts.
And as you notice, it says summer 2016. So as Rebecca said, they're not aligned with some of the changes in the numerical numbering system within 2 CFR 200 subpart D. And there may be some word changes depending upon how it's related to the 200 series, but they hold solid with regards to what you, go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh no, I'm just scrolling through so everyone can see. So they do give examples and how some of these items help you comprehend how this could come up in oversight of the CDBG grant. So definitely read through these, very helpful. Go ahead, Steve.
No, as mentioned earlier, I think it's important to notice as you read through those that it highlights, doesn't put in bold or underline, but statements in there that you really need to contact the department if you perceive or there's a real conflict of interest before you move forward. So that's one of the key components because you'll want that. And as I said, you'll need to also at the local level have a conversation with the attorney discussing that. But they do give some real good examples with regards to conflict of interest there.
I'm going to open up the next handout. So
that went to the fall period.
So the next one is 03, documentation integrity bulletin. If you guys are following along with the handouts that you downloaded from the share file drive that we provided earlier this week. So again, documenting the life cycle of the CDBG grant. Sometimes there is staff turnover that occurs, and you need to have a full comprehension of what happened before you came on board, or what overall is going on with the project. And this is especially important because the state, Steve and I, we do monitor grants out in the field along with our coworkers, and we need to understand how local units of government came to decisions and what actions took place while implementing the CDBG grant. So having a nice organized process for record keeping and documenting the life of the CDBG grant is especially important. We'll talk about this more throughout the webinar series that you'll be attending. So feel free if you have any questions, we'll try to answer those as much as possible. Anything else you want to add, Steve, to this one?
There is a table further towards the end of, as far as when you look at the layout, which is similar to what Rebecca's put together in terms of a timeline. So as far as phases, so that's probably not matching everything that we would do because we wouldn't have a lobbying statement, but under capacity. But I think it's a good timeline to take you from the beginning to the end as far as talking about beneficiary eligibility, subrecipient oversight, and record keeping. So I think it's helpful looking at that. That's all I had.
Cool. We'll open up the next one and just kind of walk everyone through. Next up is the implementing the 5 key internal controls. Oftentimes, local units of government should have internal controls already in place. The certified administrator hired should understand these internal controls and maybe take a look to see if there is a gap within it, because that would cause issue later on. And oftentimes when audits are being conducted on the local unit of government, these are reviewed and determined if updates need to occur. Steve, do you want to add anything else?
One of the features that's advantageous for the state is that on audits, when there is an audit conducted, our finance team, our chief finance officer, and then myself and others, we will actually review what is written in the audit, especially if there are items, and one of those items that comes up is internal controls, and depends upon the gravity of it or the seriousness of it. So it allows us, in terms of another look at how we monitor by looking at the audits. But internal control is important, especially when you're talking about moving money and paying for those services at the local level. That's it.
Thanks. So this should look familiar. We covered this over during the presentation. In prior webinars and trainings, we were requested from the attendees that they wanted this in a one-page document for their have to post up in their offices. So we wanted to make this available to you guys so you can keep this handy and kind of have it always having you aware of it. So that is that handout. And then this is just another slide that we wanted to highlight, and we had requests in the past to provide to the attendees, and so they could have a nice snapshot of what needs to be documented during the procurement process of professional service agreements. So very helpful for you guys as you are implementing projects. And then this is a kind of a cheat sheet for folks, and we actually got this from the HUD Exchange in 2019. I did a quick review this past September to make sure that the references for the 2 CFR Part 200 aligned with the update that occurred. So please be aware of that. This is, sorry, I scrolled really fast. Kind of give you some snapshot information on these items that we covered during the presentation today. And then that was the last of our handouts we provided to you, but if there was anything else that you want more information or you want further clarified, feel free to email Amber and we'll try to get that available to you. I know in the past, I don't know if there's any interest, the lovely timeline for the entire project within months. We've had requests for that in the past. If this group, anyone in this group wants that, please just send a message in the Q&A. We can also upload that to the share file folder to you guys to download later. So with that, we'll take a look at the Q&A to see if we have any additional questions. Otherwise, we'll finish up early. So congrats, guys. Steve, do you have anything else?
One comment for today. Please be aware that a number of these items you'll want to highlight as we move into being successful on the evaluation that takes place after the webinars. And then The second item is tomorrow, there is another webinar. And I think that's on environmental review, right, Rebecca?
Yep, environmental review record, and that is a very detailed presentation, so please have some caffeine in you.
And we will definitely need a break when we do that one.
Yeah.
So in terms of the length of it, it is intense and in greater detail. We won't try to go too far into some of the situations because scenario-wise it can be different, but hopefully it'll provide you current oversight, especially in how we're addressing the environmental review record and the timing of execution of documents within that record. So I look forward to that tomorrow. And thank you for being online for me. And for those of you, hopefully the rest of the day goes well, and I'll let Rebecca and Amber close out.
Well, thank you guys again for being patient with our technology difficulties this morning. Hopefully we won't have a repeat of that with the next webinars coming up. Again, if you have any questions regarding anything during the presentations, after the close of this, send Amber forward an email and she'll connect with Steve and I so we can answer those questions for you. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.